Across continents, a single flash cuts the night sky. Not from the usual adversary, not from the regional rival, but from an unexpected direction. Missiles launched from the Korean peninsula scream toward the eastern Mediterranean. Sirens wail in Tel Aviv. Air raid shelters are filled. Governments awaken to a reality they did not train for. North Korea has struck Israel. This is not a hypothetical exercise in abstract geopolitics. It is a scenario that forces us to ask the unthinkable. How would the world react if Pyongyang attacked Tel Aviv? Tonight, we trace the chain reaction, military, diplomatic, economic, and human, that would ripple outward from that single, catastrophic decision. Before we continue, if you want rigorous, clear geopolitical analysis, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Your support helps this channel deliver calm, evidence-based reporting on the flashpoints shaping our world. This video is for educational and analytical purposes only. It does not promote violence or any political agenda. We analyze scenarios to help viewers understand risk and consequence. Now let's begin. Section 1. The Spark, when the unthinkable strikes. The world knows North Korea for its threats, missile tests, and occasional shows of force. But the idea of Pyongyang targeting Israel is so far beyond the usual boundaries that the shock of it would cascade globally. For years, North Korea has flaunted its missile and nuclear programs as the core of regime survival. The leadership insists those weapons deter aggression and preserve sovereignty against hostile powers. In 2025, Pyongyang continues to test longer-range systems and explores new delivery methods, keeping the strategic imagination alive across capitals. A direct strike on Israel would represent a qualitative leap, not just in range, but in projection, symbolism, and escalation. What could trigger such an attack? Several dynamics may converge: proxy alliances or shared ideological ties. North Korea has historical, if limited, diplomatic links to some Middle Eastern countries. If a proxy conflict involving Israel or its adversaries reached a breaking point, Pyongyang might decide to intervene in a way that asserts influence or solidarity. Testing global reach. Pyongyang may see value in demonstrating it can strike outside East Asia, imposing uncertainty on distant lands, challenging containment strategies that assume its zone of influence is regional. Provocation or miscalculation. A diplomatic crisis, whether Israel conducting a strike in another theater or intelligence operations crossing into Korean interests, could serve as the spark. A misinterpreted radar track or unconfirmed missile launch might be treated as aggression, prompting retaliation. Imagine this. At 2 a.m., smoke trails arc across the Mediterranean. Sensors pick up trajectories traced toward Israel. The launch origin is initially unclear. Jamming and decoys mask parts of the flight path. Within minutes, air raid sirens sound in Tel Aviv. Drones start relaying live imagery, and military networks shift to high alert. In Tel Aviv, command centers shift to wartime posture. Civil defense is activated. Bomb shelters are filled. Within hours, Israel's military must decide whether to shoot down incoming missiles, scramble fighter jets, or reserve judgment until the full nature of the attack, conventional or nuclear, becomes clear. The world wakes up in bedlam. News feeds explode. Global leaders convene emergency meetings. Social media floods with footage of missile trajectories, smoke on the horizon, and hurried evacuations. The public sees a crisis that was once remote, now made immediate and terrifying. This is not a slow burn. From the first missile alarm, the crisis accelerates. Diplomacy, military lines, alliance obligations, and public expectations all collide in a storm. The spark has been struck, and now the question is who, how, and with what ferocity the fire spreads. Section 2. Military balance and the challenge of projection. For North Korea to strike Israel is not only audacious, it would also test the limits of its military capabilities and logistical reach. Pyongyang's missile arsenal has been growing in sophistication. According to the Arms Control Center, North Korea now fields short, medium, and intermediate-range missile systems, 2 submarine-launched missile varieties, and claims advanced ICBM platforms like the Hwasong-17 and Hwasong-18. One of the more recent developments deepens this possibility. In early 2025, North Korea publicized the successful test of a new hypersonic intermediate-range ballistic missile, IRBM, capable of flying approximately 1,500 kilometers at speeds to 12 times the speed of sound. While that range does not reach Israel from the Korean peninsula, it demonstrates Pyongyang's growing mastery of advanced missile technologies, hypersonic glide vehicles, maneuverable re-entry, stealth trajectories, tools that might in future help bridge greater distances via staging or intermediate nodes. Furthermore, North Korea has long shared missile technology with Iran. Analysts trace Iran's medium to long-range ballistic programs, including the Shahab-3 and variants like Ghadar, divided by Imad, to cooperation and reverse engineering connected to North Korean missile designs. Thus, Pyongyang has strategic influence over missile proliferation in the Middle East. In a conflict scenario, that influence could translate into enabling roles, for example, sharing guidance modules, stealth coatings, or re-entry tech. But projection is hard. The distance between North Korea and Israel is vast, over 7,000 kilometers in a straight line, well beyond conventional IRBM ranges. For a strike to succeed, Pyongyang would need staging bases or intermediate overflight permissions, or use relay divided by boost arrangements. Even then, payload must be optimized, small warhead, lighter structure, to survive the trajectory. On the Israeli side, defense capability is formidable. Israel operates multiple layers of missile defense: Iron Dome for short-range rockets, David's Sling for medium to long threats, and Arrow systems for ballistic missile interception. These are calibrated toward regional threats from Syria, Iran, Hezbollah, but in this scenario would be taxed to intercept very long-range missiles introduced by a new actor. Israel's Air Force, drone nets, intelligence agencies, and prepositioned assets would all activate. Command structures would go to wartime posture. Bases would be hardened, assets dispersed, airborne early warning and satellite surveillance would track incoming vectors. Israel would also seek rapid attribution radar signatures, satellite relay, telemetry, and electronic signals to determine launch origin and strike point. That attribution is critical because it shapes the strategic response. The balance is asymmetrical. North Korea would pay a steep logistics and political cost to project power so far from its borders. Israel would face high stakes but with better defense and alliance potential. The real inflection would come in how allies, especially the US, respond, and whether North Korea can evade detection or attribution long enough to blur lines. Section 3. How the United States. If Pyongyang fires on Tel Aviv, Washington would be yanked instantly into the crisis, not by choice, but by obligation, alliance politics, and raw strategic interest. The US-Israel relationship is a kinetic partnership, deep intelligence links, shared missile defense projects, and a history of rapid force posture shifts when Israel is threatened. Expect immediate multi-pronged US action: diplomatic, military, and economic, all within hours. First, posture. Carrier strike groups and forward air assets would reposition to reassure allies and deter further strikes. The U.S. has routinely moved carriers and amphibious groups into the eastern Mediterranean in past Israel crises. The USS Gerald R. Ford and other strike groups have been staged to provide rapid response capacity. That naval presence both protects shipping and signals a willingness to escalate if necessary. Simultaneously, U.S. ballistic missile defense, BMD assets in the region, and partnership support for Israel's David's Sling and Arrow systems would be urgently reinforced. Second, intelligence and force multipliers. The U.S. would pour real-time ISR, satellite imagery, signals intercepts, and shared radar tracks into Israel's command networks. That data is vital for attribution. Was it a DPRK launch, a third-party transfer, or false flag? And for guiding defensive intercepts or calibrated strikes. Expect the U.S. to offer, and likely deliver, advanced munitions, cyber tools to blunt DPRK command and control, and logistical support. All short of immediate large-scale kinetic strikes unless attribution and political consensus are rock solid. Third, diplomacy and sanctions. Within hours, Washington would convene allies, push emergency UN and G7 statements, and prepare a sanctions package far harsher than Pyongyang already faces. Diplomatic pressure would also target possible enablers, shipping firms, arms brokers, or third country facilitators. But sanctions bite slowly. The immediate need is to prevent further strikes and to de-escalate the risk of wider war. Finally, and most painfully, the U.S. faces limits. A direct U.S. strike on North Korea risks triggering devastation on the Korean peninsula. Seoul and its 25 million people sit within DPRK artillery and missile range. Washington's calculus must therefore weigh defending Israel and punishing aggression against the duty to avoid triggering mass civilian casualties in Northeast Asia. That constraint would shape American policy toward calibrated deterrence, forceful, visible, but constrained, a tightrope walk between punishment and prevention. In short, the U.S. would act fast and visibly, carriers at sea, missile defenses augmented, intelligence flows accelerated, sanctions readied, but would do so while desperately trying to avoid a chain reaction that turns a distant strike into a global conflagration. Section 4. Israel's retaliation. A calculated fury. Israel's response would be swift and devastating, but measured with precision. The Israel Defense Forces, IDF, have long prepared for multi-front warfare, yet a direct attack from North Korea introduces an unprecedented dimension. Within hours, Israeli intelligence, supported by the Mossad and U.S. satellites, would confirm the origin of the strike. Tel Aviv's war cabinet would then weigh options: direct retaliation against North Korean assets, or indirect strikes through Allied territory and cyber warfare. Cyber units in Unit 8200 could paralyze North Korean missile networks or disrupt Pyongyang's communications infrastructure. Simultaneously, Israel might conduct surgical strikes on foreign DPRK-linked facilities, such as weapons labs or missile depots in the Middle East or Africa. A full-scale nuclear response remains unlikely, but a massive conventional retaliation isn't. Expect airstrikes using F-35I Adir jets and long-range missiles from Dolphin-class submarines positioned in international waters. Israel would also activate its nuclear deterrent posture silently, a signal to adversaries that further escalation could cross the point of no return. The world would brace for Israel's counterpunch, one that could redefine deterrence across continents. Section 5. The global shockwave, the world would reel. Financial markets would collapse overnight as investors flee to safety. Oil prices would surge past $150 a barrel, driven by fear of instability across the Middle East and Asia. Stock markets in Seoul, Tokyo, and Tel Aviv would plummet as governments declare national emergencies. In the United Nations, chaos erupts. The Security Council splits, with the U.S. and its allies demanding immediate condemnation of Pyongyang, while China and Russia call for restraint. In East Asia, Japan and South Korea would go on maximum alert. Tokyo could deploy its Aegis destroyers and Patriot PAC-3 batteries to prepare for possible spillover attacks. In Europe, NATO convenes emergency meetings to assess whether Article 5 coordination might be needed if the crisis expands. Meanwhile, social media misinformation floods global networks, complicating public understanding and fueling mass panic. Humanitarian agencies warn of potential nuclear contamination if Israel or North Korea employ unconventional warheads. The International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, scrambles to monitor radiation data, fearing an environmental catastrophe. Overnight, a regional act of aggression transforms into a planetary crisis, the first direct nuclear-era confrontation between two nations, separated by continents but linked by global fear. Section 6. China's Dilemma. Beijing faces its most complex geopolitical test in decades. China is North Korea's primary ally and economic lifeline, but a DPRK strike on Israel drags Beijing into a moral and strategic minefield. On one hand, China cannot publicly condone aggression that destabilizes global markets, especially when its own economy depends on stability. On the other, abandoning Pyongyang risks losing leverage over the Korean peninsula to Washington. Behind closed doors, Beijing's Politburo would likely pressure Kim Jong-un to de-escalate immediately, while publicly calling for dialogue and restraint. Chinese naval and air patrols might quietly expand near the Yellow Sea to prevent U.S. or Japanese incursions, signaling control but avoiding direct confrontation. Diplomatically, China would use the moment to present itself as a peace broker, offering mediation between Israel and Pyongyang to elevate its global image. Yet, China's credibility would hang in the balance. If it fails to rein in its volatile ally, Beijing risks global backlash and economic penalties. If it intervenes too strongly, it may trigger internal instability in North Korea. Either path is perilous, and for China, this single event could redefine its global standing as either a responsible power or a silent enabler of chaos. Section 7. The collapse of deterrence. For decades, the global nuclear order has rested on one fragile principle: deterrence. That foundation crumbles the moment North Korea attacks Israel. The taboo against using or even threatening nuclear strikes weakens, inviting imitation. Other nuclear-capable states, from Iran to Pakistan, would take note. Red lines are fading, and punishment is no longer guaranteed. International confidence in collective security mechanisms, the UN, NATO, ASEAN, would shatter. If a rogue state can strike a non-adjacent power and survive, what stops others from following suit? The Non-Proliferation Treaty, NPT, already strained, could fracture as nations accelerate weapons programs under the guise of self-defense. Israel's retaliation, even if conventional, would be studied as a blueprint for post-deterrence warfare, blending cyber attacks, precision strikes, and shadow operations. The risk of copycat aggression grows. Small states may conclude that possessing nuclear arms is now the only guarantee of survival. In short, this conflict would not just kill thousands, it would kill the idea that nuclear restraint keeps the peace. The era of deterrence, painstakingly maintained since 1945, could collapse overnight, replaced by an unstable, fear-driven world order where mutual destruction becomes policy, not a last resort. Section 8. Endgame Scenarios. As global pressure mounts, 3 possible endgames emerge, each one reshaping the world order in its own way. Scenario 1. Diplomatic de-escalation. China and the US quietly broker a ceasefire. Israel halts its counterstrikes in exchange for international sanctions on Pyongyang and a full IAEA investigation. Kim Jong-un survives politically, but emerges isolated, while Israel's deterrence doctrine is reinforced. The world breathes temporarily. Scenario 2. Regional escalation. North Korea launches follow-up attacks, perhaps cyber offensives or ballistic missile tests over Japan. Israel retaliates through coordinated cyber strikes and covert operations against DPRK nuclear facilities, possibly with US or South Korean intelligence support. Skirmishes ripple across Asia, pushing the region to the brink of open war. Scenario 3. The point of no return. If Pyongyang attempts another nuclear launch, Israel could unleash a devastating response targeting North Korea's command infrastructure, missile silos, and leadership compounds. The result: regime collapse, mass civilian casualties, and the largest refugee crisis in East Asia since the Korean War. Each scenario ends differently, but all redefine global power, deterrence, and humanity's fragile balance between survival and annihilation. Section 9. The world after. What happens next? Even if the fighting stops, the world that follows would not be the same. Global trust and deterrence collapses. Nations across Asia and the Middle East accelerate nuclear weapons development. Japan, South Korea, and even Saudi Arabia reconsider long-standing pacifist stances. The United Nations becomes paralyzed, its resolutions ignored as nations turn inward to protect themselves. The global economy fractures into competing blocs, a US-led coalition of democracies and a China-Russia axis defending authoritarian resilience. Trade routes shift, defense budgets explode, and cyber warfare replaces diplomacy as the new weapon of influence. In Israel, the government would declare victory, but the psychological scars of facing a nuclear-capable adversary would linger for generations. North Korea, whether crippled or contained, would serve as a cautionary tale. That nuclear ambition without accountability leads only to ruin. The world enters a new age, a second Cold War, more unpredictable and decentralized than the first. And as nations rearm and re-entrench, one haunting question remains. If one nuclear-armed state dared to strike another, what happens when the next one does? A North Korean strike on Israel would be more than a military provocation. It would be a test of the 21st century international order. The event would force leaders to weigh punishment against prudence, solidarity against fragmentation, and immediate revenge against the long arc of strategic stability. We live in an era where distant flashpoints can become global crises in hours. The single act of missile launch from Pyongyang aimed at Tel Aviv would ripple across continents militarily, economically, and morally. The best answer to such a nightmarish scenario is the patient work of diplomacy, robust intelligence cooperation, and a global commitment to prevent weapons of mass destruction from ever being used again. If you found this analysis valuable, please like, share, and subscribe for more evidence-based geopolitical breakdowns. Drop your sharpest questions and perspectives in the comments. We read them all. Turn on notifications, because staying informed is the first line of defense in an uncertain world. This has been your GeoPower Report analysis. Thank you for watching.